we're gonna have an epistemological conversation here, Eric. How do we know what we know? Okay, how do we separate belief and opinion for actually what we know from actually the things that we know?
Well, I just go by what feels right personally.
Yeah. Yeah, I was, and some might poo-poo that, as you said, or woo-woo that, or we might have our head in the sand when we hear that, and you'll understand why I make those three references when you listen to this episode. But could it be that, all the choices that we make, there might be an evolutionary mechanism behind it that is attempting to inform us, that we have millions of years leading to helping us make these choices, and that in ways humans are potentially pattern recognition machines that attempt to sort out and make sense of the world around us? Could these inputs be useful, or should we just stick to the fucking numbers when we're hitting the gym?
Listen, we've got two things.
Yeah.
Millions of years of evolution to create a biological machine that can create, spaceships and cars. And then, on the other hand, contender,
Yeah.
an Excel sheet. I think we know what's better. I have all my faith in Microsoft. That's why we record on Skype.
Yeah.
So, in my opinion, I would never put faith in these silly woo-woo, poo-poo, hoo-hoo motions that we have. I'm going with the Excel sheet. You can always simply hit the asterisk to multiply, and then you put a percentage there, and then you put quotations, and you put, 3 by, I don't know, probably 5, and then boom, you're good to go. I don't understand why you're complicating this so much, Omar.
Yeah, numbers trump evolution. And I just want to thank our sponsor, Bill Gates, who bought our souls for a cool $30. It wasn't even that much when we thought about it. And we just want to thank him for the opportunity to express our opinions in a very, how do we say, yes, we are being audited as we speak. And maybe this episode won't air because maybe the overlords might not agree with what we say. But all that to say that the Excel algorithm is superior to any of your subjective inputs.
Absolutely. And poo's on the woo woo or the poo poo is on Bill Gates' face because little does he know our souls have already been sold.
Yeah.
But in a serious note, what we're talking about today is intuition. Yeah. And I think in the lifting community, sometimes only certain feelings are recognized, like rage, masochism, anger, and whatever emotion is associated with pulling yourself up from the bootstraps. And in the scientific community, sometimes the subjective data is not even considered data. And if we go to the history and the roots of kind of physiology and psychology, they're seen as separate, like the mind-body connection, as though there's actually something to connect, like they aren't one and the same, or that emotions are something separate, just kind of floating out in the ether rather than, a biochemical signal. And then it's not all just data. So that's what we're getting to talk about today. We're going to talk about what intuition is, what our kind of knee-jerk reaction to the term intuition might be, and how that applies to training, which you could talk about autoregulation, or eating, which we can talk about the actual scientific field of intuitive eating, which we're going to talk to Dr. Gabrielle Fondaro about today, which I pronounced correctly. Pat myself on the back.
You did it.
And I had to go against my intuition to say her name right. So it's not always perfect. And then also Mike Tushir of Reactive Training Systems, they're back on. And this is a number 2 for Gabby and number 3 for Mike. So if you want to learn more about them, definitely check out their first couple episodes.
Yeah, and again, these aren't our children, so I can't play favorites. I think this is a fantastic conversation that goes so many places, and what I love is that we root things in the science. Okay, so we'll talk about things like what does the data indicate, but then we always kind of get into philosophical conversation, right? We might be skeptical empiricists, but we're also human, and maybe it's important to stay human in the encroaching AI that's trying to develop and take over everything.
Greg Knuckles.
Yeah.
I think with that, that's a great lead-in. We have to respect the fact that we are indeed human, most of us, like I just coughed about. And yeah, so if we are human, we can't just put our heads in the sand because we're not ostriches.
Yeah. We're alpha males.
And
Stay
what do we
tuned.
do? Absolutely.
Let me tell everyone here a short little story on intuition, because really, if you want a recommendation, and Eric and myself, we make fantastic book recommendations when we want to arm people with the proper knowledge. It'd be a little-known book called The Secret. But let me just talk about this for a second, how I really met Eric. Because Eric thinks that it was just happenstance that we began working with one another, that I just proposed to him a Kaizen project back in early 2018, and things kind of harmoniously progressed from there. But I had my eyes set on Eric for years, actually, before that, because I had this intuition that he was the one for me. I didn't, I saw many positive qualities. I didn't know, but somehow I did know, if that makes sense. So I would study his patterns, where he would go. It was very easy to put a little GPS tracker on his phone, which is interesting. Eric, I'm surprised how many times you go to your local coffee shop. I mean, I think that's just fantastic, supporting local businesses as opposed to Starbucks. Quick aside. But I studied him for many years, noticed his interactions, his patterns, who he chose to deal with, and then slowly I just infiltrated kind of that circle. And then I figured out something that he would be largely agreeable with. So just working on a Kaizen project. And then I just pretended to casually throw it out of the blue. He agreed. And here we are. So intuition has led me to here. And that's all I really got to say about it.
I think we've discussed this before, but I appreciate your dedication.
Thank you. 3DMJ.
And yeah, I mean, you've got the 3Ds plus an S.
Yeah.
And
what's that stand for, Eric?
Wrong with that. Sweetness.
Thank you. Well, speaking of sweetness, we are joined. We have it'd be with Mike T. It's a three-peat. You're back on the cult. You said, and I quote, "With how I am with technology, they're never going to invite me back, and that is a personal challenge to us. So we knew we had to bring you back." We have Mike T and Gabrielle Fundero. Am I saying that correctly?
Yes. Nicely done.
Because maybe there's another co-host here, co-owner, that may have said it incorrectly. We're not counting. But you're back again. We loved our conversation on gut health. So we're like, you know what? Yeah, we're bringing her back on.
Awesome. Thank you guys for having me.
Our pleasure. And so, yeah, what is Mike a two-peat or a three-peat?
This is number 3 for me.
Multiply or gear lifting, remember, and then periodization.
That's
there.
right. Yep. Of course, we discussed that. All right. So I think you're the second three-peat, which, of course, it's Greg Knuckles. You can't beat that guy.
Yeah.
He's too bearded, too strong, too analytical. And I think Greg Knuckles is a great segue because the living AI algorithm that he is, we're going to discuss how, in many ways, some people think someone who feels things, I just have this feeling. We kind of poo-poo that in the evidence-based community. We kind of think that may not have value, or at least it should be relegated to below quantitative data. But I would propose, and I'd love to get you guys' thoughts on this, that intuition is basically still an algorithm and does stem from a lot of, many times, experiences we quantify in the moment, but then gets kind of filed away into the subconscious. And then we call on it, when we're thinking fast, not slow, as they say. And I don't think that necessarily means it doesn't have value. Thoughts?
Yeah. I think the other thing, too, is when we are talking about subjective data, we always think that it's just qualitative, but we can still sort of quantify subjective data. If we're talking about RPE, or we're talking about meal fullness, it's still quantifiable data. It's still something that we're doing on a numbers scale, but it's subjective in that it's individual and it's influenced by a number of psychosocial factors. So emotions may play some role, of course, because we're human beings. And even if we fool ourselves into thinking that we're thinking with 100% logic, we're not really, because we experience emotion. And the lack of emotion leads us to be sociopaths. So arguably, the application, of course, that's like true evolution. That's like the next step for humans. It's just, psychopaths, no feelings whatsoever. So I think we have to just be more honest with ourselves that, emotions are going to impact our decisions, but we can still use, quantified data as sort of like subjective markers for things. So it's not like an either or, that it's either, quantitative and useful or qualitative and emotional, and that, we can be aware of our emotions and respond to them rather than reacting to them. We can make a decision, a measured response, rather than like, oh my gosh, I feel so bad today. Like, I'm just gonna skip the gym, things like that. So, so we aren't separate from our emotions, and I just like to, I don't know, put that out there as my like, that's my foreshadowing for what I'll talk about later.
Yeah.
I love it. Planted the seed. Mike, any general thoughts?
Big Mike.
What you were just talking about calls to mind to me the I guess famous John Bros quote of "how you feel is a lie" that I like to go off on now and then. And I suppose this is another one of those times where, like, I think I get the general thrust of that idea, but I think it's misleading because how you feel isn't a lie. It's just the interpretations of what that feeling means can be incorrect. And just to what you're saying, oh, I feel crappy today, therefore I will give in completely to whatever I'm feeling. That may not be correct. However, recognizing what you're feeling and acknowledging that and using that information to make a better decision is probably, well, I mean, it's a better decision.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Can I just say, Mike, that I think it's incredible to be serious for a second because we do hear about this false dichotomy outside of fitness, you know what I mean, Eric, where we hear about like facts and then there's feelings. So there's objective data and then there's whatever that subjectivity, as if we could separate our human condition from how we perceive the world. It's impossible. Our entire human experience is one of subjectivity. But it's incredible that someone of your stature was able to immediately add some legitimacy to some of those things. So we could talk about the biopsychosocial model as an experienced lifter, as a coach, to say, hey, I think these things actually do matter. And more than that, they quite honestly inform a hell of a lot your training, the choices that you need to make. And if there was someone that, quite frankly, just wasn't as strong, wasn't as accomplished saying these things, I think it would get kind of, as Eric saying, poo-pooed. So in a way, you truly are, when it comes to training, a true trailblazer in terms of framing the experience around more than just the numbers. And I think we had a previous discussion, myself and Eric, on this about the idea that there's certain inherent bias that will probably tend to favor more with different things. So for training, as an example, we might tend to favor, we want to train with intensity because naturally we want to build ourselves up. So that narrative is kind of more appealing for a lot of individuals. So the idea, how you feeling is a lie, or like, no, you got to push harder, right? Because we're rugged individualists. So I just want to take the time and say, having someone of your stature, I remember, man, back in 2012, just start putting forth some of these things into the greater public discourse of training. Fantastic, man.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think also what we're getting at here is it's important that we define our terms instead of just operating on cultural memes, because I think depending on your background, we're going to have very different perspectives. So like you said, Gabrielle, is that quantitative data just simply means you can create a number to it, right? Mm-hmm. So anything that you can ascribe a numerical value to, even if it is feelings, like how angry are you, 1 to 5, quantitative, right? Yeah. And then qualitative is actually when you're ascribing some qualities to it. Like, so actual true qualitative research, you might do an open-ended interview, and the way you quote unquote analyze that data is that you would look for themes where you have similar qualities. Like the quality or theme we're expressing here is fear or anger or isolation, whatever. And it's very common in psychology research, qualitative psychology research. Of course, there is quantitative. So I guess the difference that underpins whether or not someone is using, say, intuition or not might have to do with how consciously aware of the information that's informing what they're doing, whether they can articulate it. And that's also different than saying, subjective or subjective. Something can be subjective, and that is just coming from your experience from the subject, or objective coming from the object. I know some of these. I think we have a long history in like Western empiricism of some of that lead us to where we are today, where even you'll see scientists poo-pooing just subjective data or things like that. And I think that comes from the whole idea. Like, I remember being told at some point in my graduate education that if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. That's the quantitative kind of perspective. And the truth is that if it doesn't exist, it doesn't exist, right? So like before we had force platforms, force still existed. We just couldn't measure it with a force plate as a very easy example. And I think if we go even further back into kind of the roots of things, we very much used to view the mind and the body as separate. And you'll even still see that leaking into certain kind of cultural memes, like, the mind-body connection. It's like, what are you talking about, the mind-body connection? We are one thing, And then I think even after that, more recently, there's kind of this, I don't like touchy-feely stuff. Like, okay, we can go cognitive behavioral therapy. You know what? Treat me like an algorithm, and these are just affective responses. But don't tell me that my emotions have some kind of value, depending on what circle you're in. And emotions, of course, have biochemical roots, right? So I think it's useful I think it's useful, at least why I'm talking about it, to remind everyone who's listening that all these things, it's not separate. It's not something that is floating outside of you, or that you have a mind, you have feelings, and then you have a body, and that they're not connected, and that one can inform the other. But rather, your entire system is interdependent. And I think that kind of says that, therefore, there must be some effect of your emotions on other things, and vice versa. So yeah, I think just starting there might help the listener know what we're talking about. Because when someone says intuition, or when someone says feeling versus thinking, or big picture, subjective, objective, I know that calls into a lot of knee-jerk responses, if you will, an intuitive response, if you will, that sometimes is anti-intuition, ironically. I think if we don't start there, people might hear things differently than what we actually mean.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. People, I think, are applying definitions based on their understanding, their subjective understanding, without trying to determine the definition as put out by whoever has developed or coined the phrase, So things like intuition, people are like, oh, that's just emotions, it's feelingsy. Or Mike, I watched your YouTube video responding to some of the things that people get wrong about RPE. And one of them is like, oh, the bar felt heavy. You're like, that's not what I mean. I don't mean like, how did you feel about it? Like, did it make you sad? It's like, no, on a scale, like an RPE scale, if we're talking about a Likert scale, on a scale of 1 to 10, where do you place this? If 10 is you're pooping your soul out and your heart is going to stop, We're just trying to create some context so that we can have a shared meaning. We all understand what RPE 8 means. And so when we talk about things like intuitive eating and people think that it's eating your feelings, it's absolutely not that. It really is trying to meet our emotional needs with things that will fill our emotional needs, and our physical needs with things that will meet our physical needs. And sometimes there's an overlap there. So it's not that there are like rules and right and wrong, but I think we have to have the proper understanding about what intuition actually means before we can poo-poo it. Before we can say, oh, that's not going to work. Oh, RPE, that won't work. Autoregulation, that's not going to work, because that's just training to feelings. Well, no, you don't understand what it is. It's not going to work if you do it like that. Sure.
Right. I've actually changed how I teach it. How I teach RPE. Like, I used to teach it as it's how hard did it feel, but that gave people this impression that it's this reliance on emotion. So now, when I'm teaching it kind of from the basics, I say that it's an evaluation of your performance, like on a scale up to a maximum effort. So, yeah, I think you're right on. Like, the definitions matter, how you talk about the things matter. You're conveying kind of they're more difficult ideas to wrap your head around. If it was something more concrete, more tangible, something you can see, touch, that's a little bit easier of a concept to grasp. But because we're talking about things that are kind of on the periphery of our awareness, I think it makes it a little bit harder.
Absolutely. And I think you guys have both brought up two of the most common punching bags in the quote unquote kind of evidence-based community, which is, in my opinion, ironic, because intuitive eating is a completely legitimate scientific field. It started, which I'll let you get into it, Gabriel. But it started as kind of almost a clinical tool, and then has been researched extensively in the treatment of psychological distress related to eating and body image. and compare it against weight loss, and has a strong argument for when and how and why it might be useful. And perhaps if someone does want to do weight loss, it might be something to do initially to kind of establish a better relationship with food. But that's kind of something I look at it as before they go into perhaps something more approachable. Something more specific to losing weight. And then likewise, I think autoregulation has been a punching bag because people just view it as subjectivity. And it, now I would say is a pretty, actually, even before the work that myself and Dr. Zerdos have done, and even Hackett and colleagues in Sydney, specifically looking at like repetitions in reserve or repetitions to failure or RPE, even before that, I would say it was a well-established, understood concept. You can find way back in the day, some of the initial ways that people would implement progressive overload in a very kind of strict sense in a rehab setting was based on how the performance just went and how the performance goes today, and then we will or won't increase load. And you can find super training getting quoted by Mann, and super training was originally quoting Knight from the 70s, who was doing this in a rehab setting. So it goes back to almost as long as DeLorme. So I think that's an interesting thing when you see evidence-based people taking shots at this stuff. I've seen very prominent researchers tweeting, velocity-based training is better than RPE-based training because it's subjective. And I'm like, no, show me the research where velocity-based training is better. Show me the quantitative data, ironically, that it's actually better, and that just doesn't exist. So a good segue I'd like to hear about is, Gabrielle, can you tell us more about intuitive eating and kind of what people think it is and what it actually is?
Mm-hmm. I think people view intuitive eating foremost as sort of a goal, that eventually they will be able to intuitively eat. And that right now they can't, they have to lose the weight first, or they have to do whatever else it is. And then eventually they'll be able to reach a point of intuitive eating. And intuitive eating, as I just recently heard in Evelyn Tribley's podcast with Dan Harris that I thought was really insightful. An attendee at one of her seminars said, so intuitive eating sounds a little bit more like a framework of self-care. So it's not even just a process. It is an overall framework of self-care. So a skill set that would be used in the framework of intuitive eating would be mindful eating. Now, mindful eating was sort of the initial term that Tribley and Associates developed in the mid-90s. And they, that conscious eating was what they used in the mid-90s. And that was sort of being conscious of what you were doing. And then a few years later, that was reframed as mindful eating. Michelle May is another practitioner who defines mindful eating as eating with attention and intention. So you set about some intention for how you want this meal to make you feel, physically, really. And then you eat that meal, you check in, you rate your feelings of satisfaction during that meal. You could use an objective numerical eating or hunger scale. And then you sort of reflect on, how did that meal make me feel? Was that something that I would want to repeat again? And that's a very sort of like cut and dry version of it. So that's mindful eating. It's a skill that you can practice within the framework of the intuitive eating approach, but you could also practice it independently. And the reason that I point out mindful eating is because there's so much overlap between mindful eating and mindful training. And so many of the concepts that we talk about, whether it's RPE or we're talking about mind-muscle connection, pump, soreness. So all those things, there's so much overlap. So intuitive eating is not a diet. I don't even think that we would want to call it the anti-diet diet, which is like sort of how the media is portraying it now. It is not a tool to control or modify weight in any way. So it is aligned with HAES, the Health at Every Size movement. HAES is not, although people believe HAES and intuitive eating are anti-weight loss, they are not. If weight loss were to occur as a side effect of these health-seeking behaviors, it is what it is. Or if weight gain occurs, or if weight stability occurs, that is what it is. The problem arises, I think, when people are using intuitive eating as an approach to lose weight in most cases. They want to be able to practice all of the principles of intuitive eating, like respecting fullness and honoring their hunger and accepting their bodies. But at the same time, they do have this internal struggle of not really accepting their bodies. They want their body to change. They want to be able to diet, so they want to ignore the hunger. And that's just really counterintuitive to the entire purpose of intuitive eating, which I really think is to just facilitate normal eating patterns. So that especially in individuals with disordered eating, because as you mentioned, this has been extensively studied in individuals with binge eating disorder, quite often they're not eating food in response to physiological hunger. They're eating for a variety of reasons, quite often emotions. And they're using that food to try to fill some need. And because food is not able to fill those emotional needs, we eat past the point of fullness without regard for really even how the food is tasting. So this is kind of flies in the face even of, food hyperpalatability and things like that. In those cases, it's not even really so much about how the food is tasting. It's serving a very different purpose. And so applying the principles of intuitive eating with a weight neutral approach really allows individuals to just facilitate a normal eating pattern. And in some cases, we will overeat, in some cases, we'll undereat. But really, I think one of the main benefits in those individuals is they feel much more in charge of why they're eating and much more aware of why they're eating. And when they have an emotional need, they can meet that through other avenues and sort of use food in ways that are beneficial to them.
Gabrielle, do you think do you think that on social media then the concept of intuitive eating is being grossly misapplied by a large swath of people? Because what you just said about one of the parts of the framework is the concept of weight neutral, where when, at least from my purview and what I tend to see, or even individuals, they'll approach and ask questions about, I want to lose weight is usually how things start. It's like essentially I'm uncomfortable with my body. I tried maybe counting macros, or there's a lot of, again, social media figures that then will say, I went from macro counting to judging satiety on my own, like my fullness, and then just eating intuitively. So they'll use that term without the framework. And it's kind of, we had that discussion on veganism, Eric, where we're talking with the game changers, where people kind of want everything. So it's like you want the health, the mental health, like the framework. You also want the composition results of intuitive eating. So it's going to be superior for your body composition. Kind of same idea with game changers, where it's like ethically, absolutely, if you want to choose veganism, more power to you. It's like if you then want to take the logical leap and argue that from a performance standpoint, it's also superior. So it's kind of just this holy triangle or trinity of things that it checks off all the boxes is where it potentially becomes dangerous. So do you think what I tend to hear, and I could be wrong because I'm a small segment in what I'm hearing in the community, that intuitive eating is misapplied, and largely it's individuals that still struggle maybe with their body image and with their weight, and this is a new approach then where they're going to attempt to use it. It's like, this one system didn't work. This intuitive kind of sounds fun. It's kind of, I don't have to count macros anymore. That sucked. Like, let me just try this instead.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that's almost it's sort of like if we want to look at intuitive eating as a tool, even though I don't really like to view it that way, but it's sort of like if a person says, I want to get my one rep up on squats, and another person's like, oh, awesome. Well, why don't you just do like dumbbell goblet squats? Well, dumbbell goblet squats may have some application, but it's not in really increasing your 1 rep max back squat. So that's sort of what's happening here. It's like, oh, this seems like this is new and exciting and it's fairly misunderstood. And I think really that's one trend that I'm seeing is the marketing of misunderstanding. We have so much misinformation out there, like people just don't know any better. And so it's easy to sell these things. So, and the other thing is, I think there's also a difference between intuitive eating, this self-care framework, and what people call eating intuitively, which may be just renaming eating mindfully. So if we're eating mindfully, we're eating without distraction, eating foods that are good choices for us physically and, aligned with our ethical values. And there's nothing wrong with eating also because you enjoy something. And there's nothing wrong with eating when you know you're not hungry and you're going to eat something anyway. Like there are no rules there. But you're setting some intention for the meal, you're focusing on the meal, and then you're reflecting on it afterwards. And you could certainly eat mindfully and also, change your weight. But for people to try and use, even the whole process of intuitive eating or use that label, I think that's just creating so much confusion, even if they have good intentions and even if they don't really mean that they're talking about intuitive eating, TM, that it's just creating so much confusion. We probably need to just like pick a different word, probably for everyone's benefit, so that we understand, like, what are we talking about with intuitive eating, self-care framework to help facilitate normal eating patterns and like address cognitive distortions, versus eating mindfully with attention and attention, versus, I think Flex Success has done a great job of talking about like restrained eating and informed eating. So making sure that when we're having these debates, that we're actually debating about the same thing, that like I'm not talking about intuitive eating and you're talking about something totally different, like, yeah, we're not going to be able to see eye to eye. We don't have shared understanding. And so we can't communicate effectively.
That's really well said. And I've actually been the responsible for misusing the term intuitive eating maybe a handful of years ago, before I really dug into the research, because I was using it colloquially almost as a response to what people were talking about. And now I've come to be very intentional and specific with my wording. So, for example, I wrote an article about an autoregulated bulk, or I've written about using internal cues to guide something that's not weight neutral, because you can use like internal cues are obviously part of intuitive eating. That's what's guiding you. You're trying to become more in tune with them, and you're eating in a more homeostatic way, just based on what your feelings and your environment and honoring your hunger and fullness are. But I think because we have limited tools, I think our natural thing is to go, well, if not A, then B. Like if I'm not tracking macros, if I'm not doing X diet, then there must be intuitive eating because I don't know much else. And I think getting a greater understanding to have granularity around the elements that go into each one of these tools allows us to figure out other ways of doing things. So I think auto-regulated eating is something, we could talk about, where essentially, like intuitive eating, is you're responding to environmental and physiological cues to eat, and it typically ends up being weight neutral. That said, that the weight neutral that we have in 2020 might be a higher weight neutral than we would have in 1950 because of the environmental pressures, lower activity. And we know that higher activity levels create greater control over hunger and satiety, or I should say more fine tuning of hunger and satiety. And just objectively, you're burning less calories, although that does get, auto-regulated. People actually, hey, if you do have that meal and you purposely ate more and you're aware of that intuitively eating, you're probably just not going to be as hungry next meal or the day after, There's not this, our body doesn't clock out every 24 hours and that's a permanent surplus I was in on that day. I'm just going to gain weight, So anyway, what I'm getting at is you can manipulate your environment to create a new normal. And I think that's what a lot of quote unquote diets do, is they create these rules that you then habituate, and it results in a lower calorie intake. And I think you can do that in healthy and unhealthy ways. There are these overly restrictive diets that cause problems or even nutrient deficiencies, either, physiologically or psychologically. But there's also things you can do, like just, decreasing energy density, eating more fruits and vegetables and a higher protein and being more active without ever actually intentionally trying to do anything. You might find that intuitive eating with those habits in place results in a lower body weight. And I think that's interesting, but that's not necessarily the same thing as, like you said, intuitive eating TM. And we would be, in my opinion, remiss to not look at those options. And I think kind of the default position we got into was understanding quote unquote flexible dieting, which was transposed as just counting macros and then living on macros. And it's just a very, very limited skill set. So I think people understanding what intuitive eating is and isn't and what its components are is actually really critical, so people can understand what a transition to something that's a little less, hand on the wheel constantly, even though you could have, your autopilot on and be probably in a better position.
Yeah, absolutely. And the one thing that I think we might have gotten ourselves into with the reliance on macros is the lack of awareness of those hunger and satiety signals. So we eat, especially when it was like, oh, I have to eat every 3 hours or something. It was regardless of hunger or satiety. I eat at this time. I eat all of the macros. I eat until my plate is clean. and pay no attention to internal cues. And those internal cues, that's something called interoceptive awareness. So our ability to perceive internal cues, whether it's a full bladder or a full stomach or how sore we are or how many reps and reserves you have or what was your RPE, we're able to sort of intuit our rating on a number scale based on those internal cues. Now, individuals with disordered eating have attenuated interoceptive sensitivity. So they have, and that's independent of whether we're looking at a person who has obesity or overweight or anorexia nervosa. Something about that, they're either sort of ignoring those signals or they're having a difficult time identifying them. And so if we have years of ignoring those signals, and then we come to a point where we don't want to count macros anymore, well, when do I start eating and when do I stop? Because if my only answer is I start eating at a specific time and then I stop when all the food is gone, this is a really great opportunity, whether we're talking about intuitive eating, TM, or we're talking about mindful eating, to get back in touch with those cues. And I think that that might also be where people got stuck, shifting to using RPE if they were, and Mike, I'm asking you this question too, because I'm curious, if they went from just percentages, and then all of a sudden your recommendation is on a scale, can you determine where you fall? Do you feel like that was kind of some of the pushback that people had initially?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think that I hear that a lot. Like, I wouldn't want to rate RPE because to me, all the sets feel heavy. Like, okay, well, that's not, I mean, there's so much wrong with that. But yeah, and I make that recommendation as well. So if somebody has no experience with rating, RPE or reps in reserve or anything like that, and they want to get into it, how do they get started? Well, I say just keep doing what you're doing and just practice rating. Just rate each set that you do. Don't let it change what your training is or anything like that, but just practice rating. Because at some point, you come up to a training session that calls for, 85% for a triple, and you think, man, every time I do 85% for a triple, it's a 7.5 RPE, but today it's a 7. I wonder if I should add a little weight to the bar. And when you have that thought, now it's time. Now you're comfortable and you're okay with making that transition. So that's kind of how I delineate, when you're comfortable enough with it, secure enough with it to move forward.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Would you say, Mike, that almost part of the reason or the necessity for RPE is that subjective experience you go through, the ability to create some sort of framework to assess it, where essentially your feedback into the system matters. It's not just a hard number you're being given, like 80%. It's like, okay, like, we joke about the old school Russian systems where it's like, here's your next, we're basically going to control all outside variables, so you're good to go. You're going to do 80%, and like, not that I don't want to hear any feedback, but this is the program and you're going to do it. And essentially there is no place for your own experience. Would you say that's part of what led you to develop that?
Yeah. So the original development came from a lot of people, advanced lifters, talking about how they were training, and you would hear things like, sometimes I'll leave a rep in the tank, and things like that. And I was reading about the RPE scale as it pertained to endurance training, and kind of joined the two together. I thought, well, yeah, you could leave a rep in the tank or two or more than that. Like there's lots of things that you could do. So it kind of became this outgrowth of that, and me trying to understand what were. So you would have these advanced lifters talking about how they would do their training, and a lot of it does qualify as intuitive or instinctive, or it's a reliance on this internal sense of good and bad. And I was trying to understand more of what are they paying attention to when they're, they said, well, I was supposed to do 6 sets today, but after the 4th one, I could just tell it wasn't there, so I cut it. Okay, yeah. What was the signal that told you that? And how can I teach this to somebody who doesn't just know it? And so it was kind of trying to tease that out, I guess.
Yeah.
That's really, I think, kind of a lot of the original idea, inspiration for where I was trying to go with it.
Because what I was going to ask from that, Mike, is just the role. What do you think the overall role of intuition is when it comes to training? Because if we take intuition meaning something that could be understood immediately without the need for conscious reasoning, would maybe one of the potential benefits, if we try and think about it afterwards, that immediate reaction we did a said like, oh, that that was tough, whatnot. I think it's, my performance, what do I rate it? It's an 8. Like, I didn't think about it, versus someone that's trying to piece out all that information. Well, let me think about the bar speed. Let me think about this. Let me try and rate it. Well, what's the time of the day? Like, how did this feel? Like, all these other things that actually, as you input more variables, as you think about it more, you become in ways less accurate than the system that you internally have developed without even being aware of it, where you could be, no, that was hard. It's an 8. Was that part of it? Like, what role then? So let's talk about, in the context of training, Mike, intuition and then subjectivity.
Yeah, I get there's definitely a sweet spot in there somewhere. I think that if you completely go off the cuff, that may, I don't know. I think there's going to be some variance there. Some people, I think, are going to nail it pretty well. And I think this is something that you get better at with practice. And I think once you've practiced it enough, maybe that's where you end up. I think I'm pretty much with how you're describing it right now. I don't think I started at that point. But at the same time, I was just having a conversation with someone today who was talking about not even RPE specifically, but reviewing video, and how they'll watch the same video of, say, a squat, and they'll watch it one time and it looks good, and they'll watch it again and it looks pretty terrible, and then they'll watch it again. Well, no, actually, it was fine. So there's even something that you're watching from an outside perspective that is the same over and over. You can have a different subjective perception of it if you're really to little details and focused on, oh, well, my knee came in, oh, but the bar speed was good, oh, but this, oh, but that, so yeah, I definitely hear where you're coming from. And I think that it's funny, because to me the scale that I came up with, a 9 is, yeah, I could have definitely done one more. I want that to be like as literal as possible. And I'll hear somebody say sometime, they'll rack the bar, could you have done one more rep? And they'll say, well, yeah, if you had a gun to my head. Well, nobody's got a gun. No, there's guns in the gym. That's not what we're asking. No, there's no children gonna die if you don't get the next rep. And it's just, in that moment, could you have done one more if you wanted to? And it's only that. So yeah, definitely overthinking things can lead to less accuracy, for sure.
I think it's really interesting what you're talking about, because your initial awareness of, hey, these advanced lifters have these elements of intuition, is basically looking at the conscious competence model, which, for those who don't know, I've talked about this before. You start, when you try to develop a new skill, you're doing it wrong and you don't even know you're doing it wrong. Then you get a certain level of awareness of the skill that you are doing it wrong and you know you're doing it wrong. That's a very frustrating part. And then you move to where the first level of proficiency comes from. You are, with conscious effort, doing it correctly. And then eventually, when you become someone who's actually mastered a skill, you are unconsciously doing it correctly. It is something that you do not have to actively think about. And that is almost by definition where these advanced lifters are most of the time. And you're trying to go, all right, I want to get people there. And so what did you do to get there? And they're going to have a very tough time describing that. So it's almost like we have to take you a step back and start to think about and operationalize what are all the things that led to you doing this unconsciously to help someone else get there faster. And I think the mistake and the error people make is they think, okay, now that I'm quantifying these things and now that I'm trying to learn how to autoregulate, they don't want to leave that stage 3. And I do think the closer someone can get over time to with that skill to just going, right, that was an RPE 8, the more accurate it will be. I know when I misrate something, I'm thinking about my emotional attachment to that number. That's the most often thing for me. Like I've squatted 200 before. I just hit 190. My initial thoughts is a 9.5, and then I go, it's probably a 9 though, because I've done 200, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is something that is very inherent to powerlifting because we're so numbers driven. And I think that's sometimes why powerlifters give pushback against the idea of RPE and they want to be numbers driven. But what's crazy to me is it's so embedded in the sport that you need to know how much is left in the tank when you really think about it. Literally, what you have to do on the platform is play the Price is Right with your strength. And you're telling me you don't want to know how many reps you got left in the tank or how close to failure you are? Like, I don't need the skill, all right? Just give me a percentage of my max from 8 weeks ago. I'm good. And then you get on the platform and you only get your opener and you wonder why. So it's kind of, I think it's these interesting counterplays of the personalities you get in the sport and the demands of the sport where the critique doesn't actually match up with what you really need. And it falls apart upon really thinking about it, but it's such an emotional thing. Yeah. So I wanted to say that, but another thing I wanted to say is I think that there is a big difference between autoregulated training and intuitive eating, because training is something that we impose to create an adaptive stress to then get a physiological change, while eating is something we have to do to stay alive, you know? You don't get to opt out of eating, but you definitely can opt out of training, you know? And I think some of the concepts might look a little different for those reasons, but I am curious about where we think there might be overlap or lessons from one to the other. So, Gabby, I know you've been thinking about this a lot lately, kind of the crossover between intuitive training, if that's a thing now, and then intuitive eating and what that might be. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah. So I want to share because, as I mentioned, I had actually had the great opportunity to speak with Evelyn Tribbley, one of the authors of Intuitive Eating. And when I said intuitive, she said, just don't use that word. People think it's all emotional woo woo, and it's not about that. It's not just based on your emotions or, like one of the things she said in the podcast, Instagram, intuitive eating is all about pink donuts. People are like, oh, they think that you feel bad on a day. And so intuitive eating gives you permission to eat because you feel bad and, makes you feel better. Now, intuitive eating does give you unconditional permission to eat. But at the same time, part of the framework of intuitive eating is that you're doing so with reflection. So you're thinking about what you would like to eat and why. And is eating going to be the best thing for you right now? So one analogy I can give to training, you go into the gym and you see your arch nemesis over there and he's having a banner day and you're like, I know today's supposed to be like, RPE 7, but I hate that guy. I want to make him look like an asshole. So you go in and you like ego lift and, you throw your back out. Or it's the guy who goes in and trains to failure every day because the pump, okay, those are not really like, you could make the decision to do that. Okay. But in the long run, are either one of those methods beneficial? No. So I really view mindful eating and the process of intuitive eating like trying to get the guy to stop going to failure on every set every day. Like we just want to facilitate normal eating patterns. We want to facilitate a progressive training program. It's not going to work if you're going to failure every day. Intuitive eating, they even say in the book, kind of, it's not this eat as much as you possibly can at every meal. Now, during the exploration phase of the intuitive eating process, that's usually what happens because people are coming from a place of so much restriction. They still have those thought patterns of, I'm not going to be able to eat this again, or I haven't eaten this in so long, I'm going to eat it all right now. Kind of like when we're coming back from an injury, we might hit it a little bit too hard in the gym because we're like, oh my God, I'm so excited to be back. I feel so good. And then, we might injure ourselves. So yes, that can absolutely happen. And there's nothing wrong with that happening. It's just part of the process. But that's where people really get stuck. They think I'm going to be in that phase forever. I'm going to not know what to do forever. Just like you mentioned, like, oh, I know this isn't really serving me, but I don't know how to change it. And so they don't have a lot of trust established. Really, the way I talk to my clients is that you are forming a relationship with yourself. And just like meeting a person for the first time, you have to build trust. And that takes time and experience and reflection and success to some extent. Like if a person tried to use RPE and just misrated every time, and like 3 years later, they're like, I still don't know how to do this, it doesn't really seem to be working very well, then, okay, then that person's not going to be able to establish that trust with themselves, So if a person is taking the time to establish that trust and give themselves permission to sort of like feel things out and, learn RPE, just like you said, practice. It just takes practice. How do we get to the point where we can eat mindfully just automatically and it becomes an automated habitual process? You have to give yourself the opportunity to do it. If you never trust yourself enough to sort of take that big first scary step, then you're not going to be able to establish those skills. And I think that comes with any new endeavor. But one of the things that I really emphasize is that, when we give ourselves permission to, learn and maybe misrate things, or give ourselves permission to learn how to eat until we're just satisfied, then we have the choice to do those things and we can grow as practitioners, as individuals, in our training or in our eating habits. So I think it's important to sort of separate it from that idea of it being just an emotional, completely just emotional process that doesn't have any thought involved, and flip that on its head. It's a very thoughtful process that has emotion involved.
Mm-hmm.
I like where you were going with that on the missteps in forming better decisions later, because that's something that's a complaint that gets brought up a lot with RPE as well. Like, gosh darn it, on Instagram, all these people misrating their RPEs, People love to log other people's RPEs on Instagram. But I think that if you do misrate a set, then as long as you learn from that, what's the big deal?
Yep.
Okay, so you got it wrong this set, and say on your workup, you're supposed to go up to a triple at a 9 RPE. So on one of your workup sets, it was really a 9 RPE, but you said it was an 8 because you wanted to go for it, and then you ended up missing a rep. Okay, yeah, that's not ideal, but most of the time, that's as bad as it gets, and you might be a little embarrassed, but it's got some cost, but it's not going to derail your whole training cycle or anything like that. So next time, you've learned from this, and you can make better assessments next time. And the cost of messing it up this once is so worth it in the fact that if you learn from it, then you get it right so many times in the future, and that's a trade that I'm willing to make. So people ask me if I get upset when clients misrate RPEs or anything like that. And it's like, look, if we're learning from it, then we're going the right direction. And that's way more important.
Absolutely.
Would you agree, Mike? And maybe I'm going to put this forth, and I'm curious what everyone thinks here. The individuals that tend to think maybe they want to be devoid of the emotional component of lifting, where they view themselves more as an input-output machine. They want to be given numbers, and it's like, I'm going to hit these numbers, and they think, oh, like I have to assess myself. No, this is wishy-washy. It's like, well, if you think about it this way, a percentage of your 1 rep max is a quantitative approach to objectively measure what you're lifting compared to what you did, but it's a framework that could be faulty, where that is what you hit a long time ago or 8 weeks, however long ago. And so it's predicting performance based on prior performance, but the subjective model or incorporating RP allows you to kind of have some input into the system to be, you know what, I can actually try and assess my performance on this day, how I'm going to perform. And maybe that has a larger impact on things because we only know so much. Like what can we quantify objectively? It's only a small slice of the puzzle. So if we want to over time understand it better, and of course there's going to be many mistakes made because we are individuals is a subjective experience, and we're learning basically how to read ourselves. And even in the process of reading ourselves, that enters another variable into the loop, and that's fine. But this eventual process of contributing and trying to assess and being aware of your lifting will ultimately produce a better lifter than just completely removing everything outside of just the numbers in the gym and all these assumptions that, hey, we're just going to control everything else. You're going to hit this and it's going to be great. It's like it's a weird argument that I hear by individuals. It's basically a long cop out, it feels like to me, potentially of some people that just don't want to put in the work to better understand themselves as a lifter and how that impacts ultimately their lifting career and their lifting success. It's kind of like, I don't want to deal with that.
Mhm.
Well, I agree with you, and I think that, you know, I mean, if we think of it as this paying attention to internal cues, it's there whether you want to acknowledge it or not. And it just seems weird to me to just say, well, I'm just not gonna, I'm gonna ignore that. You know, it would be like saying, I'm just not gonna count sets. I don't think sets are a thing. Like, well, it very clearly is, and it would be better if you did it. You know, like even if you don't do anything with it, just knowing how many sets you did would be useful. And I kind of put it in the same boat with that. And I wonder what you would think, Gabrielle, about how that relates to paying attention to internal hunger cues and things like that.
Oh, absolutely. I love that you said it's there whether you pay attention to it or not. You know, I think if we want to get to a place where we can have, auto-regulated eating, regardless of how we want to use that, if we wanted it to be weight neutral or we wanted it to use it for weight modification, we have to be able to recognize those cues and give ourselves a lot of there's so much other information too that is available to us at mealtime. So, questions like Michelle May brings up, the first question, am I hungry? So right now, if I'm not hungry, maybe I just don't eat. Maybe I give myself permission to not eat until I'm hungry. And then, things like, why am I eating right now? Well, if it's not because I'm hungry, what else is it? So like, what lifts am I going to do today? Why am I going to do those lifts? Like, does it make sense for me to do that today? And then, other questions like, what am I going to eat? And then, how is this energy going to serve me? So when we're thinking about like, what are the lifts I'm going to do today? Why? How are they supposed to feel? And what am I moving toward with today? Like, if I'm in a strength block or hypertrophy block, it has to make sense for me to do the things that will bring me to that goal. And so mindful eating also can bring us to a goal. We can say, okay, am I hungry? Yes, I'm hungry. I can feel physical hunger right now. Where is it? Oh, it's about a 2, so I'm pretty darn hungry. Well, how much food do I need? My stomach is only about the size of 1 to 2 fists. So probably 1 to 2 fists of food, I'm going to start out with that. Well, what do I want to eat? Well, I'm about to train soon, so probably something that's pretty high in carbs and it's got some lean protein. I don't want a ton of fat or fiber right now. It might upset my stomach. Put that into a bowl. I'm eating my meal without distraction. Just like when you're in the gym, you're not like hopefully you're not on your phone like mid set, maybe between sets, but you're not like, oh yeah, I'm texting. I guess I'm going to go for a 1 rep max. We're focused on what we're doing in the gym. We have that mindfulness aspect. So we're eating without distraction. And then as we're eating, we're thinking, okay, I wanted to get to like maybe a 5 on the hunger scale. Maybe I wanted to get to a 3. I mean, this is where you can go for weight modification if you want to. If you go for all of your meals, take you just from very hungry to just not hungry, you may be in a deficit. If your meals take you from not super hungry to full, you may be in an excess. So you set your intention, how should this feel? I should be at an RPE 8 on this set. And then halfway through your meal, you're like, oh, I'm actually satisfied right now. I'm going to wait on eating the rest of this. Or after you're set, like, oh, that was a 7. All right, cool. Like, I feel good today. Maybe I could, progress a little bit more rapidly. And then maybe you're like, okay, that was my meal. That's all I needed. I feel satisfied right now. And then you go on about your life. instead of having like external rules of I have to do this, oh, I'm supposed to do this many reps at this percentage, I didn't get it. Like, what now? What am I supposed to do now? We don't have the ability to make changes based on those internal cues. We're just kind of like, I didn't do what I'm supposed to do. How do I adjust? If we break our diet rule, okay, well, F it. I messed up this meal. Might as well throw the rest out. Throw the whole training plan out. Throw the whole day out. Throw the whole diet out. I think it really allows us to be much less emotional. And even though I know it's reactive training systems, but like less reactive emotionally and more just kind of responsive. And then after the meal, if we're like, oh, wow, that was a gut bomb. And like, I think that I might blow out my squat suit. Then we're like, oh, save that for later. Don't eat bran cereal before I go to the gym. So this is we're just collecting data and we're using that to inform future decisions. It's not about, I feel bad and I'm just going to lift whatever I want, or I feel bad and I'm going to make myself feel better with food. That is one option, but there are so many other options. And when we step back and look at that we have the power of choice, then yeah, I think we can be better athletes and lifters and, just like live better lives because we're not under the pressure of these external rules and feeling like we're failing at them in some way.
I think some of the external rule, like we were talking about it being there, whether you operationalize it or not. Mm-hmm. I think some of that comes down to responsibility. So for example, if I write a percentage-based program for someone, and this is even before I was aware of RPE, when I write 3x5 at 80%, I'm thinking they can probably do that and be submaximal because most people can do like, I don't know, 7 to 9, maybe 10 reps with that. I just gave you what I think your RPE is. So you putting your head in the sand doesn't make RPE not exist. It just means that it's my responsibility as the coach, or it's, I bought this program. It's, I trust Chico, or I trust Jeff Nippert, or I trust Eric Helms, or I trust Kaizen, whatever. I bought this program. You know my RPE better than me. And then, invariably, if you've ever ran a percentage-based program for long enough, or that peaked, or that was hard, there's going to be some days where the RPE you experienced probably wasn't intended by Eric Helms or Chico or whatever. That 80% might have actually been like max, and that wasn't what I wanted. So guess what? Whether or not you're the one rating it, or I'm the one rating it, and I didn't show you kind of the black box of why I programmed this way, you may or may not match up. And invariably, because we are dynamic creatures living in a dynamic world, it won't match up. And I think that's, so then if you can recognize that, because some people make this false comparison of RPE doesn't exist if I don't track it. I'm just going off my percentage 1RM. I like objective numbers. Or it does exist because I'm paying attention to it. And come on, it's not like quantum physics here, all right? So it's going to be there no matter what. It's not Schrodinger's RPE, okay? And the reality is, so the question is you do you want to have your head in the sand, right? Yeah. And then what consequences come from that? And I think, like you said, you made a great point, Mike, that if you are not going to pay attention to it because that's not your preference, there is a cost for that. If you want to be the person who puts it in the hands of the coach and just does a percentage-based program because it scares you or you don't like to rate it or you're not good at it, you're basically saying, I'm going to accept that. I'm not going to work on that. And we're just going to use this different system and I'm going to accept its flaws. Because I guarantee you, someone who's bad at rating RPE, the way they're going to get better at rating RPE is not by ignoring the existence of RPE, even though we've already established that it must be there. And just going ahead. And I think that parallels so well with what you're talking about, Gabby, with intuitive eating, where if, you know what, I mean, how many times have someone said to me, if I didn't track macros, I'd be obese? And like, well, okay. So do you think that's going to change just by tracking macros? I mean, that's basically just saying like, well, if I don't take my finger out of the dam, water's going to squirt and it's going to flood the whole place. And I'm like, so you're going to build a house next to the dam? What's your plan here?
Yes, exactly.
At what point are you going to not just be tracking macros your whole life? So I think it's kind of just kicking the can down the road or putting your head in the sand either way, in my opinion, if you don't acknowledge the reality, which is that these things are there and you don't develop that skill, you eventually are going to have to deal with that.
Yeah. And I think that's where people are kind of feeling stuck, is with that fear of what happens when I pull my finger out of the dam. I just, I'll just give me macros, or, oh, and I've heard that so many times. Oh, if I just ate whatever I wanted, I'd be 300 pounds. Well, truly, if for some period of time you eat as much of whatever you want, I mean, because that can happen, as I mentioned, some weight gain might result. But there are other phenomena like taste fatigue and just habituation. Guess what? I have actually gone through this process. Now, I will say I was unable to have peanut butter in my house for some time because it was one of my sort of trigger foods. And I thought, oh, well, I'm going to shape my external environment, make it easy for myself, just not have peanut butter. Okay, my finger's in the dam. Well, eventually I'm going to be around peanut butter. Eventually I'm going to want to be able to be in a house with peanut butter. Take my finger out of the dam. I ate peanut butter at every meal. Like, just, I wanted peanut butter. I ate peanut butter every meal. And this is something that I actually heard from Nancy Clark, who's a really prolific sport dietitian. And over time, the peanut butter is just fucking peanut butter, right? It's just like, okay, fine, it's peanut butter. I have probably 4 jars of peanut butter in my cupboard, and I have bags of chocolate and stuff. I can eat them whenever I want. Like, why would I reduce the joy of eating that by eating it until I'm sick? Why would I take every set to failure if I'm going to get injured and then I can't train? So in time, it sounds like people, I think, shortchange themselves. Like in time, yes, you will get to a point where those things are no longer novel and they're no longer exciting. And you'll start to be like, I want to eat some vegetables. Like, give me a progressive training program. I want to deload, So those things happen over time. And it's like, giving yourself, trusting yourself enough to say, okay, I want to actually do the work. That's the other thing, is there's a lot of internal work. If we're only modifying our external environment to make it a little bit easier for ourselves, we're not modifying our internal environment. And that's what really, really has to change.
Well said.
Yeah. I think that's an important point, that it's really easy to assume that your emotional state that you're in right now is the only one that you will experience, and that if you're really, all you want in the world is some peanut butter, then why would you assume that would ever change, but that can change just like lots of other things can change, that how you feel right now just won't last forever. Yeah.
Because how you feel is a lie, which is what we've established.
So glad we could go back to the tonic.
Right.
It is kind of not absurd to me, but to use a music analogy as it now relates to training. If you have a shit ear, so they talk about the concept of perfect pitch, where people that are born with perfect pitch, they're able to identify notes. Those with good relative pitch are able to develop over time and recognize what a note is. But if you want to start to understand things, so we could take the classical method of learning music, where you learn what the notes are. So you read what they are, you understand what the positions are, let's just say on a keyboard, you're told what to play. And that's kind of like a program given to you. So you want to play some Rachmaninoff, you want to play some Chopin, cool. It's like, it's in the key of G, like, I will tell you what to do, you do it. Okay. And so that actually removes the emotional component. But on the other hand, if you eventually want to learn how to either express yourself or then move outside of that, learn your own language, you need to be aware of the notes. And if you were to tell someone, like, that's why it'd make no sense for a musician. It's like, oh, your ear is shit, bro. Like, I play your note and you're like, F. You're like, no, that actually is a G. It's like, you wouldn't say never do that again. Just stick to what I tell you. If you actually want them to be a capable musician, they have to learn over time. And luckily, we do have that objective measure. So on, RPE, while it is subjective, there's some framework there, right? Like, if you fail a weight, it is not an RPE, right? There are constraints that we place on it. So the same idea when it comes to music, you could get that feedback. I thought it was this, so I thought I had this subjective. This is what I heard subjectively. And then objectively outside, here's the reality of it. And then over time, you start to understand the greater framework, which is your experience and what you want to express. And now instead of just reading from the music, you could produce music. And that, kids, is called jazz. And that's RPE. Yeah, but it's wild to me, because in other aspects, it completely applies. And then for some reason, when we're kind of, once again, these rugged individualists, when it comes to training, it's like, nah, it doesn't matter at all. And I do think we joke, myself and Eric joke a lot. But the way we frame things can be very powerful, right? Where it's almost this emotional response to talking about emotions, which is kind of wild in and of itself. But I was going to make the joke at the beginning of this episode. It's like, hey, if you don't want to, recognize emotions, or you hear it, it's like, just think about it like this. It's like Yuval Harris has that book, Homo Deus, where he puts forth a lot of different claims. Like he talks about consciousness kind of arising by accident, just a lot of things where the current data in neuroscience, cool, whatever. But he mentions that emotions, they're not just, in quotations, emotions, they're biological evolutionary mechanisms of us trying to assess things. So it's not like it comes from out of nowhere. And I think people get too attached to certain words. And I'm curious what everyone thinks here now, kind of talking about even the word intuition, where language is a shared experience. And sometimes in the current context of things, what we'll say will provoke a response rather than intent. So we're kind of arguing essentially about semantics, where it's kind of, I know what I'm talking about. And maybe to say that individual, I forget, it was the senator or so forth, that said, I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it. And so it's one of those things where we're trying to talk about these things, and then people get caught up on the semantics of the word as opposed to the intention of what we're trying to say and what we're trying to communicate.
Yes.
Yeah, as just a brief thing here, like I feel like all of us have screwed ourselves as people who are aware of this, because in the hardcore lifting community, obviously we've discussed that kind of rugged individualist, that go hard or go harm mentality. That is antithetical to some degree to kind of honoring your awareness, or at least it's perceived that way. I think it can actually help you push harder. That's often like the way things are framed. People often forget RPE can allow you to go heavier sometimes and do more volume. And same thing with intuitive eating. Like, oh, you just can't stick to a diet. Like, you're hardcore. Like, I'll drink blood if it'll make me shredded. Like, so just entering the arena of bodybuilding, powerlifting, strength sport, we're not going to be culturally accepted. And then if you want to be even dumber and have more people hate you, then you go, you know what? The sector that I'm going to enter for that is the heavily analytical, quantitative, science-minded people, and then I'm going to try to hit them with qualitative, subjective things. And we'll just see how that goes. So I have been, just masochistic in my pursuit of academics, and I'm sure you both feel the same way. I just wanted to put that out there. So.
Oh, yeah. I'm really interested to see and hear what people will think of this, talking about intuitive eating and then like training and RPE and, actually trying to bring context and like draw, create a bridge here. It's one of those things where you can like piss off absolutely everyone at the same time.
Iron culture for the win.
We're here. We said we're here to unite all lifters, but in fact, we're here to piss everyone off.
Unite them against us.
Against us, yes, exactly. That's exactly it. United against a common enemy, then they're all friends now. So
yeah, it's like the end of Watchmen, the comic, where there's a threat an external threat that unites humanity once and for all. That's Iron Culture. We are that existential threat. That's Eric and myself.
There you go.
Anyway, I derailed your question to them though, Omar. So carry on.
I had a thought too so I'm just thinking, having been on the platform and you guys have all been there and watched, like, can you imagine trying to do a PR with no emotion? Like nothing, you just go out. I mean, like, absolutely, even if you're not like emoting it, but like with deep down, like absolutely flat affect. It's absolutely absurd because, without emotion, we don't have drive to do anything. Like literally, we would just sit and do nothing. We wouldn't eat or drink or procreate. We would just like be alive for a little while and then like end, So I can't even imagine like people who are like, oh, we don't need to have emotion in this. Like, it probably helps you a little bit, actually.
Well, there's certain emotions that are loud, like anger, judgment of others,
Yeah, those
whatever.
Are...
Yeah, whatever the emotion of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, that one. Yeah.
Well, it calls to mind to me. I had a friend of mine. This would have been kind of in the first part of the 2000s, who was really into the Shako programs, and at the time, Coach Shako himself wasn't accessible to those of us in the West. So we had these numbered templates that existed on the internet, and that was it, and I mean, to think back on it now, like it's amazing how little we knew about them. But I had a friend of mine who just did them and competed at a really high level, just doing like, I mean, it would string them together too. Like, well, first you got to do 29 and then you follow that up with 34, and like it just did it rote, and he was a good friend of mine, so we managed to get past our training, not seeing eye to eye on training, right, somehow. But he I remember him telling me at one point, like, well, I know that these programs were written by Coach Shako, and that they've been done over and over by hundreds of lifters, and they all got stronger. Therefore, I'll get stronger as well. Autoregulation not required. Well, come to find out, like later on when we have access to the coach who wrote them, like not only were they not done by hundreds of lifters, they're done by one lifter. Like that 29 points to a specific athlete. So it's a program written for a single individual. Right. And not only that, if you were to do the programs with Coach Shako, he's watching you. He's manually changing the program as you go through it. And that's ubiquitous in sport. Every sport that you've ever heard of takes an approach like that. The coach is there. The coach modifies the practice as you go through the practice based on the athlete's performance. That's an auto-regulated approach. That's how most training programs have operated. Now, in powerlifting, we're in this kind of weird scenario where lots of us train by ourselves or in small groups with not coaches, and we need some sort of framework to bridge that gap. So I think it's just kind of a way to operationalize that for someone who may not be, a coach with 20, 30 more years of experience.
Mm-hmm. Now, Mike, you're talking about the value of coaching and experience. Now, coaches make decisions, and I know all of us have worked with people, act as trainers, coach individuals, and you mentioned how this is a very, very important gap to bridge. And I think one of the greatest values, like sometimes the way I describe autoregulation is, hey, autoregulation is when you were doing, that's where auto comes from. Or you could look at it as autoregulation as regulation based on your automatic feedback, like biofeedback. And so it could or couldn't have a coach, or it could be the coach giving you tools to handle it on your own, which I think is most what happens in modern times when, unless you just happen to be living in the same city as one of the better powerlifting coaches, you're going to find somebody online and you can be sending videos and Excel sheets and et cetera. But I think in our community, we're talking about how we're the pariahs for two different reasons. It's become like we've screwed ourselves. Like if we did become these self idealized gurus and we were like this top down system, we could say just do it because I told you so, and questions would be not allowed. But because we've created this paradigm, hey, questions are important. We have an athlete centered approach. We have a bottom up approach to either nutrition or training. I want to give you tools. We invariably get questions. And I have found myself very hesitant and afraid to just say, you know what, I think this is what we should go with, or my gut tells me this, or my intuition goes with this. And I have sometimes made poor decisions because I have then had to justify and try to use what I can actually remember and the things I know, quote unquote, to make a decision instead of going with something that was more intuitive. So I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on intuition and coaching and the value we place on it, the struggles we have with it, the perception of athletes when they get it, and maybe how we haven't given it a fair look.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a good example of the separation between sort of being at the whim of our emotions. When people think of intuitive eating, they think of it as synonymous with emotional eating, really, even though it's one process that helps us to kind of break that cycle of emotional eating. So if we want to give it, another word like Evelyn had recommended, or just point out that it's not super emotional, but as coaches, when we are intuiting something, it's not that we are just at the whim of our emotions and we're, super, that's my cat. Hey, I'm also wearing a crazy cat lady hoodie that I got from Goodwill. So shout out to the cats.
Shout out to Goodwill.
Yes.
Yep.
But that we're not, making emotional decisions, but rather we are making decisions. And I think this is one of the words too that really bothers people, is like talking about inner wisdom. So there's inner wisdom that's talked about in the intuitive eating book and in the mindful eating book. And people are like, oh, that sounds really like woo woo, hoity toity inner wisdom. But I don't really know of another way to describe it aside from it is the collection of all of your experiences against the backdrop of evidence and research. And part of the reason you have all of those experiences because you started probably leaning more heavily on textbooks and things like that. And then through trial and error, you were able to determine and kind of filter the best practices. And so from there, when you're in a pattern, and the brain is so good at sort of recognizing patterns and applying things, whether that's adaptive or maladaptive, but your brain's like, oh, we've been here before. Here are some options that will probably work in this situation. And then we can kind of feel, quote unquote, we can, intuit, but like, this is probably the right thing based on, all of this. And if we have good rapport with our clients, just like if we have good rapport with ourselves, there's a mutual trust there. So, when you are saying like, I think this is probably a way to go, there can still be feedback. Your client can still say, I want to do this other thing. And okay, we've discussed it, the options, and, you're in the driver's seat. I'm helping you navigate. I'm your Sherpa. So it's the same thing. I think when you're doing that, you're reflecting with yourself and you're in decisional balance, that you have that feedback there and that you can then intuit, okay, this is the right decision for me, not based on just emotion. I'm not reacting, with urgency. I'm thinking about what I want to do and then reflecting on whether that was a good decision afterwards.
Yeah, when it comes to training, I kind of suppose I could be of two minds with this. On one hand, I can relate to your story, Eric, as well, that sometimes you make decisions because you have a gut feeling that this could be useful or not, and a lot of times when I do that, it's more in like an exploratory sense of things, and that's an interesting interaction by itself, because I've had lifters, hey, I noticed that you prescribed wide grip bench presses or slow tempo deadlifts or whatever. Why did you do that? And the real answer is what you're talking about, Eric. The real answer is this has worked for other situations that are similar to this. I kind of want to see if it's going to work now. But that is so not satisfying of an answer that I've come to understand that that's not even really the question. What they're looking for, the real question that I think they're struggling to find words for is, give me a reason to believe in this.
Yes, 100%.
And so, okay, now I can say something, what I'm thinking or what's kind of operating in the background that, might be wrong, probably is wrong on some level, but the thing that we care about is the effect that it's going to have or not have, and we can still test that out. I really value the the intuitive input from the athlete as well. Letting me know what kind of their perceptions are and what they think is going to work, or what they think they need for a next block or something like that. But I think it is a bit of a balance too, to balance that with what does your data say? Because I can imagine scenarios where you've got a lifter who they just really like slingshot bench, and every time we've done slingshot bench, it's just not gone that well. I mean, okay, to some extent, that's the person who's like, well, if I was doing this, I'd eat pizza every day. Like, well, you probably wouldn't. And I think also, I haven't found that many people who just are really in love with some exercise or some protocol or some way of training that's just really bad for them. And that could be a selection thing, because I'm working with competitive powerlifter types who care about their improvement. That's primary. So it could definitely be that, but I just haven't seen it that much. I don't know. I'm kind of rambling all over the place with that, but I do think it's the intuition is useful. I think there's some limit to it as well, and I just feel some sort of caution to not go too far in that direction, because Eric, I'm willing to bet that you remember the Weider principles, and one of them was like instinctive training, which I don't know how it was originally intended, but the way I came across it was like, you just kind of do whatever, which is, everyone did curls every day. So so
which is
there's that.
awesome.
So everyone one is what it sounds like. Now, I will say, I think one of the dirty secrets about this is that some of the largest opposition, at least it seemed to me back in 2012, and everyone can correct me here, to RPE was actually coaches. Or other coaches, because there's the old guard, so to speak, where anything that challenges their framework, right, is going to be kind of a threat. And so I think the larger discussion, kind of what you're saying, Mike, where you said, what are they really talking about? When I ask you this question, hey, why do you program this bench? They don't actually want to know, the logic behind it. It's like, okay, I believe what you're saying sounds like you know what you're talking about. I'm going to believe you. And so it almost, RPE and other things that take in, I feel, the subjective measure almost demystified the experience. And part of the old coaching model is an asymmetry of knowledge. And so that's kind of where you get a guru, right? And we'll see that with the dogmatic approach, where I have the answer for everything. I'm your coach. You can ask me anything and everything, and there is a rationale, there's a reason behind it, and that allows you to be impenetrable, impervious to criticism, because you're so beyond and above that. And that's kind of, once again, the old model. And I think that plays into marketing, why we believe people, cults, not even being funny when we talk about this. And so there's so much when it comes to the psychology that then people might depend upon that. So a coach where they want to be well regarded, they want to be respected, even how they talk, the cadence of their voice. I mean, they've done studies how people posture and how they position themselves, the body. So many things that go together. I'm the coach. I'm the authority figure. And when you start questioning instead of praying at the altar, we're like, well, wait a second here. Like, why are we doing these things? The most dangerous person in any society is the person that is not, subservient to that doesn't just think, oh, I'm just going to follow these rules. The person starts questioning, like, well, wait a sec. Well, what about this? Well, why are we doing this? It unleashes almost a Pandora's box. And I think one of the things when we talk about intuitive eating, Gabrielle, I would put forth, is that the Pandora's box that's being open is one that people, they don't want to get in touch with themselves, but it's also their identity, where let's say getting in touch with their emotions, it's really synonymous with weakness, how they feel. Like, oh, my emotions, right? It's like, if they're asked them, like, oh, I got a lot of emotions. I got anger, I got rage, I got hate. It's like, okay, no, you're just giving synonyms for the same thing. So they have this weird collection of their own thoughts, so their own kind of baggage that they're bringing to a definition that wasn't there. So I think what I saw, at least with the pushback, or not the argument against intuition, is like, well, I know better than the athlete. Like, I'm the coach. It's like, who's this person? It's like, and so I think it opened up a larger conversation that actually, in my opinion, have made, on average, coaches better, athletes better. So once again, giving responsibility to the person, as opposed to that previous knowledge asymmetry. I know everything. You want to know something, just ask me, I'll tell you. And so I think sometimes that question, and I like what Eric said, where it's like, someone asks you, it's like, I don't know. It's like that, the power in not only I don't know, but I think it's going to work this way, not I know. Because to admit what we truly know and then what is an informed maybe belief is completely fine.
Omar, I think you and Mike just really touched on something really important about coaching, and how we've seen a shift towards athlete-centered coaching and a bottom-up approach. And the potential argument against it, or some of the, I would say, existential crises some coaches have when they themselves shift towards this, is that the reason that pushback occurred is not only did the coaches have to give up some control, but they also had to give up the illusion that there was something in the black box that was magical, or at least not necessarily the illusion, but the front that they put forward, because that's what everyone else is doing. Like if Poliquin's the model, no disrespect to the dead, I've also got to be the guy who has an answer to everything, is authoritative, and has that. And I think a legitimate but short-sighted argument against this bottom-up or athlete-centered approach is, well, you don't want to have the athlete asking that question, the real question that Mike T got to, saying, hey, give me a reason to believe in this. And you go, look, it's, you know what, the power's in your hands. I don't know. This is just intuition. This might work. It might not. Hopefully you hit some PRs on the meet, but maybe not. I mean, I don't know. You can get hurt tomorrow. Like, obviously, that's not what an athlete wants. And I think, John Kiley has talked about this a number of times, how once you get to that point with Dunning-Kruger as a coach, where you're like, oh, and now I know enough to know how little I actually do know, it can turn you into this quivering mess and lack of confidence, and the athlete is not getting what they need. So I could see an athlete or a coach saying, no, we want to take a top-down approach so we can give the athlete that positive expectancy. We give them the placebo benefit on top of whatever we're doing. We get the belief. We get them the buy-in. But I think that's almost, again, putting your head in the sand or pretending something isn't there. If the athlete is coming to you wanting a guru, that's because they're afraid that they don't have the answers, that there isn't an answer. They're having an existential crisis, and you're their blanket, You're their boo-boo, right? Not that I named my blanket that. That was a random name. Don't ever ask me about that.
Yeah. Completely random.
So, totally just made it up. So I think it's there no matter what. That fear that we don't have the answers, that I won't make progress. I'm hiring a coach because I can't do it on my own. However, it's okay. Well, what does the coach put faith in? And I think Bryce and I talked about this a little bit. It's that what you want to put the faith in is that you're in partnership. You have their best interests in mind, that you will find a solution together, and that you will leave no stone unturned, and that eventually we'll find success because two heads are better than one, and you're the keys to your own success, and I'm going to help you figure out what's inside of you to move forward. And I think that is a very different perspective than the very simplistic, well, who do we want to put the power in? The hands of the person who doesn't know what they're doing, that's why they're hiring a coach, or the coach? Duh. That's not really what we're actually, propositioning one against the other.
Yeah.
I mean, that's highlighting it right there. Like, my answer to that would, the way I view coaching is that coaching is leadership, relationship, and creativity. And if you say to the athlete, well, I actually don't know why we're doing this, and I don't have any answers at all. Okay, you're failing on the leadership part. Maybe you're being really, really honest, but you're not providing any leadership. But
you're not filtering your own fear before you're talking to them.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the leadership isn't pretending. I suppose one way to play that would be to pretend that you do have the answers. But I think what you're putting forth is a better model for leadership, in that, you're saying, here's something better to put your faith in. Here's a better system to put your faith in. And, we can get there together. And I think that's a more healthy approach. And honestly, I think that's just kind of how you got to go about it, because information is out there and people are going to find it, and, they're going to ask questions. And if you don't have, this kind of more collaborative approach, then, you take more of a Bobby Knight approach. Well, I just don't think that plays real great,
Yeah, eventually, and especially with the development of AI, if a coach is nothing more than a program developer or an app or a macro calculator, you will eventually become obsolete. And so there has to be value added to your coaching. There has to be something that client gets from you and your relationship that they can't get from a computer program that is more powerful than the human mind, So it's that, I think some level of vulnerability, and a lot of people view that as weakness, but vulnerability actually requires a great deal of courage and fortitude to be able to say, this is going to be a partnership, and that while I am a content expert, you are also an expert in yourself and your personal experiences. And so there has to be an exchange of information. And that's really how, I've approached coaching. And before I was a coach, I was an educator, and I had to do advising. And instead of being these are the classes that you have to take, I would talk to the student and say, what do you like to do in your free time? What are you struggling with? Where are you succeeding? And have a conversation, because that's how you really, I mean, it's all data. Like, even if we want to be like, oh, emotions, no, it's all data. It's all useful information that can inform your coaching and your recommendations, your training, your nutrition. So it's like, let's not just throw all that, all the subjective data and just get objective data. I know Mike and James have talked about this before too, when they're talking about like markers of recovery and fatigue, and people are like, salivary cortisol and heart rate variability and all this stuff. And like, so, okay, your athlete looks like on their Whoop or whatever that they're recovered, but they go out and they look like they are about to fall over. Like, that's data still. It's information. You can use all of that. And so, like, it's the same thing. That's why I like to draw those bridges between that and, if we want to call it intuitive eating, but really more mindful eating as a subset, a skill that we can collect so much information if we're paying attention. And we then are empowered with that information rather than just, oh, I'm just going to eat these macros for the rest of my life. Like, what happens if you don't have your food scale with you? Like, what happens if they get rid of nutrition facts labels? How will you procure nutrients,
Yeah, we just call that an extended fast then. So you fast until you get
fast.
Yeah, Eric and myself are very used to that. And just two things again.
Yeah, it's the vacation length fast. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I think it's fantastic what you said. Two quick things to note. You don't have to say AI. You can just say it has a name, and it's called Greg Knuckles. And then two, when we talk about value add, that's what myself and Eric, we're so thrilled that we like to do with our clients to make them feel special. We send them a calendar of ourselves that is exclusive for only clients, once again. And that way they get something personal that they can't get anywhere else.
Trust building.
That is special. Yes. Yeah. I'm sure December, you guys wearing your little like Santa hats and stuff.
That's it.
Yeah. And it's nice because I'm in the Southern Hemisphere. It's the summer. So I wear like a Santa hat and then board shorts. It's good. Yeah. But I really liked how we've kind of talked about how, and Mike, you started to allude to this, is that you can't use a purely intuitive approach as coaching. And then Gabby, what you said about it all being data, and mentioned how if you were purely just trying to act like a human version of an algorithm, shout out Greg Knuckles, then you can be surpassed by the things we're developing now. Like for example, Mike T, you use the emerging strategies approach, so you can get an objective assessment of all the variables that seem to connect with performance repeatedly. And I think what we're looking at here is, hey, the human brain is incredibly complex and is taking in so much data all at once to then put that into a feeling or an emotion or a judgment, probably better said. And then we have that over years and years and years of doing the same thing. And we have these pattern recognitions. Like you said, that can be maladaptive or adaptive, like PTSD, not that helpful. However, paying attention and coaching for 10 years, that might really give you some good intuition. But at the same time, there are limits to it. And I think just to make sure, because I know the kind of the way the human brain works also is to go, if not A, then B. We're not saying that you shouldn't use objective data. It's just that we don't want to kind of take the science fallacy of, anything that we create, this new shiny technology like testosterone, cortisol, is going to be better than our subjective experience, because we're dealing with like arguably millions of years of evolution to get some of these signals. But I think the key is that they can work hand in hand, the subjective experience and then some type of objective system. There's actually a really good systematic review that came out in 2015, I think, by Saw and colleagues. And the title says it all, and I pulled it up because it popped in my head. Monitoring the Athlete Training Response, Subjective Self-Reported Measures Trump Commonly Used Objective Measures, a systematic review. And it says it right there. But I think the important is that these subjective self-reported measures, they're subjective self-reported measures that have been published in peer-reviewed science, which means we're talking about validated questionnaires, things that have been structured and created in such a way that we know they're reliable and that they're valid. So they measure what we think they're measuring, and they are repeatable. They'll get a similar enough response between individuals and within individuals upon multiple occasions. And I think, that's basically my whole PhD is I took Mike T's system, which apparently seem to have reliability and validity based on, there's some decent lifters who use it. And then me going, okay, so let's really look at this, and finding that indeed it was, it is reliable and valid and under the right conditions. So I think that's just a really important point, is that intuition is a collection of data in the most incredibly complex living biological organism we have, sans Greg Knuckles, the human mind. And that, of course, since we can't recall and hold all of the experiences in our like currently accessible memory right now, we can supplement that with data that we've recorded and used with some system. So it's not either or. They can be used together, but we never want to become biased towards just one or the other. Like, you've definitely heard the science denialists, like, you're overcomplicating this. I know it feels right. And I think that's when you can become the old gurus of old, who they buy into their own hype. As their prestige rises, their own thinking, they buy into their own hype, and they think they need to pay attention to less. And they get more and more positive reaffirmation, and they get this very inflexible system, so that everyone goes into the meat grinder. And the people who drop out, they no longer get added into that pattern recognition system. I think one thing that I've become increasingly aware of, as I get more of an online profile, as 3DMJ gets more of an online profile, we get a lot more positive feedback. And I think the echo chamber nature of social media means that we're going to be filtering for more positive feedback. It also means that people know they have an expectancy effect before they work with us, and they filter themselves, so that people who totally don't align with our beliefs are not going to work with us. So we're going to get more and more people who already believe it's going to work, and might even just have a greater likelihood of it working because they've tried it or believe in it or align with it, and it reinforces our anecdotes. So we have to be even more circumspect as you get more at a higher level, because we all can think of those coaches who just, I do what I do, I know it works. And then you can meet hundreds of athletes who are just like, no, that didn't work for me. But those people did not even get into that pattern recognition process for that coach. So they're actually getting worse over time, or at least stagnant. So it's very important, I think, to use some of these objective measures to supplement that intuition that you're developing, or your intuition can steadily get off course over time.
Yeah, I think that it's sort of a refinement. So, we have this intuition, but we're constantly sort of polishing it and remaining open to new evidence that shapes those intuitive thoughts based on, objective information. And so it's the same thing when people are talking about, part of their problem, I think, with intuitive eating or eating intuitively is that they think that nutrition has no role in that, and that it's literally eating just whatever would taste good. There's a very big difference between eating what would serve you best versus eating what tastes best. Obviously, some foods are tastier than others, but one of the principles is using they call it gentle nutrition. And sometimes, that bothers people because it sounds like emotional, but it really is just cognizance of the nutrients in various foods. So it's not, going all the way to the point of just like only eating what tastes good, but also that we're doing things that would probably be prudent to us. So we do take the time to learn what foods are highest in carbohydrates, what foods have a lot of fiber and vitamins and minerals, what are some options of like lean proteins and things like that. Just that there are not external rules for what we should be eating based on, what a diet says or something. So there's not like, oh, these are that you have to do, everyone has to squat. Like that's no, you have to squat. That has to be in everyone's program. No, for some people that's not appropriate. They're not going to be squatting. So instead of doing that because someone says that you have to, you're like, I'm going to squat or not squat because it's appropriate for me. I'm going to eat this meal or this meal because it's appropriate for me based on all of my experiences, but not based on like external rules that are not informative in some way. So like external nutrition information is one thing, but like dietary rules, that's something very different. And so that's where the idea of not getting stuck in the sort of diet mentality. I mean, and that can happen to us as practitioners too. We get stuck in X mentality of this is how coaching is supposed to be, or this is what my athlete should be doing. And we're not going back, or, people shouldn't be, intuitive eating. Well, guess what? That actually is an evidence-based approach. Like you can go back and read about it, so there's objective data on these things. And I think that that's just a really important aspect is constant refinement so that our intuition is not becoming something that's only based on, like you said, that kind of sounding board and just only positive return.
Mm-hmm.
A thought occurred to me here that, like we were talking about issues with terminology. and just making sure that we're all talking about the same thing. I wonder if there might also be some issues with like just baggage with certain terminology that I wonder, because the bedrock concepts of everything that you're saying resonate with me, but I can also see how some people might not even want to listen if we have a term like gentle nutrition, where if it was just a different term,
Yeah.
then the hardcore lifter types, of which I arguably am one, I guess, but might be more inclined to listen to things like that, So I mean, I don't know what that means or if we should take anything away from it, but I wonder if it might be less of an issue for people if they were willing to like put aside that knee-jerk reaction to some of the terminology.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to have these conversations, because I know that's part of it. People get so caught up in the, gentle nutrition, or, they're so caught up in the words. And I'm like, but look at the description. Like, imagine that it's, just who's it's and what's it's words that we've never heard before. It's another language, but look at the description. Like, what do you think about these actual principles? Do those hold up? How do they apply? How can they be useful? Rather than getting caught up in like, those little nitty gritty arguments about like, this word. Well, it's someone else made that up, but the principle itself is independent from whatever they wanted to label it.
Diet Coke versus Coke Zero.
Ooh, the mortal struggle. We know the answer, Mike, is actually just Crystal Pepsi. Like that was the right choice. I'm only gonna...
I like Pepsi Max personally.
Okay, if we're really talking here, I'm gonna go with vanilla Coke. Okay, so
yes, vanilla Coke Zero.
Wow, see, we all reach agreement. I think at this time I'm gonna recommend the book I recommended only about probably 4 or 5 times on this podcast. Thinking Fast and Slow, just when we talk about what comprises our intuitive thought process. So the thinking fast component, and then the thinking slow is kind of being aware of those bias that we might develop over time. I like what Eric said was maladaptive, where it is such a thing where if you expose an individual to a variety of inputs and then they're trying to they make the quick choices, over time, you can get shittier as you surround yourself. So essentially put yourself in your own bubble, and there's so many inputs, you start believing your own hype. It's like, I can't be wrong. And so you're even more ready to offer an opinion or the intuition that might not be as fully formed because, again, all your inputs are wrong. So you just become this shitty system that it keeps progressing. But because you've already overcame that initial, inertia, and you've developed the momentum of being a successful coach, it's like you're becoming more and more popular, but you're actually becoming shittier and shittier, which is kind of crazy. Like, I joke, but that is something that happens, unfortunately. And so I think keeping ourselves honest, or the continuous desire of self-improvement. So one of those concepts that, you don't believe your own hype. So, you stop drinking your own Kool-Aid. Was like, wait a second, I've had tremendous success. So you know what? I can't be wrong. In fact, everyone, it's not me that's wrong. It's everyone else around me.
If it's one lesson you can learn from history, it's that hubris never leads anyone astray.
No.
No. I call that the difference between being impressive versus effective. Like, lots of things are impressive, but not necessarily effective.
We're stealing that. We're gonna steal that. We're gonna let you know. It's like I don't know who said that. It was I don't know.
Not to ascribe it to the wrong person, but I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
This podcast is not coming out, Gabby. So
we just made that choice. Like, you know what?
Yeah. Or at least that section won't be in it.
Yeah. I think when Eric came up with these two guests and he approached me, I knew. So, again, not playing favorites here, but I think when you have a certain level of self-awareness and introspection that you then bring to a conversation, it gives some legitimacy maybe to some concepts that would get, and we've been saying woo-wooed and poo-pooed a lot. And the third example, I love Eric, where he said, our head in the sand, we're not ostriches here, okay? We just don't do that, okay? Is that giving legitimacy two concepts that should be paid attention, and that's why I said at the start about Mike Teixeira. I remember, like, I read up on this is like 2012 autoregulation, and it did resonate with me. I'm like, yeah, like, a lot of these things to me intuitively, I said, it kind of made sense, and then I would make some videos. And there's a whole seismic change that happened at YouTube Fitness, and that's like a whole other tangent. But one, to even deadlift in 2010 was dumb. Like, just on YouTube, it's like, why are you doing this? Like, you're gonna snap your shit up. Like, it was kind of like, oh, I see this person doing it, this is what's gonna happen. And then you talk about auto regulation. At the time, untested powerlifting was kind of more popular. Like, I even remember Mike T. I think you competed at Rum. Like, that was the place to be, right? Like IPF who? And so you start talking about, like, well, your subjective feedback is important. And I remember, like, me getting roasted, I don't care. But it was just one of those things where it's unthinkable that would even be relevant. So it's been really cool to see how things have changed and how things have progressed, and this continuous process of improvement. I want to open the floor now to our guests to maybe circle back, reiterate something, reflect. This is your time, okay, to shine. So if there's any input you want to give right now, the floor is yours.
Oh man. Well, I think that, in the fitness industry, we see these pendulum swings. So it's like we go hardcore, like, and it's for so many things, for, IIFYM, for, nutrition timing. It matters so much. It matters not at all. And so it was sort of like we went, super strict, like, macros, and then it's like no macros, like anti-diet. And it's like, we probably will be so much more effective versus impressive if we can find middle ground, and if we can find shared meaning and understanding and have productive conversations about this. Because I think and I want to say, like, I'm not dogmatically in either camp. I don't practice intuitive eating all the time. I don't do all of the principles of intuitive eating all the time. I'm not a Hays coach. I do try to eat mindfully. But my point is not to, like, sell this to people. My point is just because I'm an educator at heart, I just want people to really comprehend what we're talking about so we can have productive conversations, because that's the only way that we can move forward. Not to say you're wrong or this won't work or whatever, but to say, okay, come with some evidence and, like, a measured response, and let's have a real conversation about this. But first we have to have shared understanding and shared meaning. So it's like, I'm not trying to, because I know people probably will assume that, like, oh, you're trying to convince. Like, really, I just want everyone to understand. Like, I don't care what you want to do, but at least don't misuse or misapply or bastardize these terms, because there are so many things here that could be incredibly effective for people. But if we don't represent them accurately and we don't maintain the integrity of the principles, we lose out on our ability to apply them.
Well said.
Yeah. Let's see. I suppose if I'm going to just reiterate anything, it's that I think that these signals that we're talking about have meaning. And, something else that was said earlier that I think probably slipped under the radar is just paying attention. The thing that all this comes back to, I think, is just paying attention to the signals, to the data streams, if that makes anyone more comfortable. Whether that's internal hunger signals or a reps and reserve count, or how did your knee feel when you're doing Bulgarian split squats or whatever. That paying attention to those things, if you pay enough attention and kind of amass enough of a background of information, then it really helps a lot. It's not going to give you, like, a definitive answer, like, yeah, we definitely need to do this many sets of that many reps, but it gives you some background to make decisions. And I think that's as far as you're going to get when you're dealing with a complex system. Yeah.
Well said. I think that that's a really really important point to reiterate. I mean, because all of like data collection can, like Omar was pointing out, become counterproductive if you're not paying attention, or if you're paying attention to the wrong things or making the wrong associations. So yeah, as simple of a point as that is, I think it is, like you said, it went under the radar and it's something that's critical. So yeah, I think I just really appreciate both of you guys' thoughts on this, and hopefully people can have a less knee-jerk understanding of what intuition, autoregulation, and intuitive eating is now. So thank you guys both very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, I will say I want to ask first before we go, because we've now reached the closing time, and we're not kicking you out, but you need to leave. I will say that, Gabrielle, where can people find you?
Please don't come to my house if this upset you. I'm nomadic anyway. You won't be able to find me. They can find me at Vitamin PhD on Instagram and Facebook, vitaminphdnutrition.com, and also on renaissanceperiodization.com. If they want to learn more about gut health stuff or coaching stuff, I have stuff on RP Plus, Revive Stronger, and Stronger Experts. So yeah, absolutely reach out. I do like to hear feedback of all types. That's how I get better.
Mike?
You can find me on Instagram at Mike Tushear. Also, Reactive Training Systems on YouTube and reactivetrainingsystems.com. Yeah, so pretty straightforward for me as far as locating my social media presence. But yeah, same goes for me. I'd love to entertain questions or some back and forth on this. That I'm not I guess an educator in the formal sense of it, but I like to think of myself as enhancing the understanding of the powerlifting community in particular, but people that lift weights. So if I can help with that, I'm happy to.
The guy that changed
Not an educator.
Game. Yeah.
Not an educator, but an information enhancer. You heard it here, folks.
Can I steal that when people are like, what do you call yourself if you're not an expert? I'm a gut microbiome information enhancer.
That's right. Oh, I remember now. You're not a gut health expert. You're a gut health professional. And now Mike is a powerlifting information enhancer. So I love it. I think create our own terms here at Iron Culture. Self-identify.
Nothing wrong with that. Bio,
Absolutely.
Whatever gets them clicks. Well, I will say thank you to our guests. I think this conversation has been very illuminating. I appreciate everyone listening. If you want to show support for the cult, because this is a cult and we will accept no opposition, you could go ahead and leave a rating and review on iTunes. We do read them. Eric, they're pretty damn nice. What do you say?
I feel primarily like complimented, and the ones that don't have 5 stars, I scroll right past just to keep my algorithm as best as possible for my own sanity and health.
Yeah, but they don't accurately reflect what anyone's thinking. The 5 stars clearly do. Yeah. So we'll do our best to read them. Also on YouTube, if you go ahead and leave a comment, we'll do our best to respond. We're back every single Monday. We'll catch you in the next episode.